Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. So, this is the first of a series of webinars exploring the military's role in the climate crisis by our coalition, Earth Day to Dax Day Coalition. And we will be not only discussing current problems of military extraction on an industrial scale, but also discussing solutions as well. So, yeah, thank you for being here. Please ask your questions and give feedback in the chat box and we'll try to answer. And if we don't get to your questions as you ask them, there's also Q&A at the end where we'll try to get those answered, and please make sure you're on mute. All right, next slide. So, who is our coalition? So, we're comprised of Portland based organizations working to educate our community on corporations that profit on war and environmental destruction and challenging those same institutions, as well as raising awareness of global crises relating to these injustices. So, our coalition organizations, including International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, International Migrants Alliance, Anak Bayan Portland, that's the org I'm in, International League of People's Struggles, Portland Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee, Code Pink, Extinction Rebellion Portland, and Sunrise Movement Beaverton. Next slide, please. So today we'll be talking about the military fossil fuel industrial complex. And what is that really? So basically, a military industrial complex is a nation's military establishment, as well as the industries involved in the production of armaments and other military materials, such as like armaments and fossil fuels. So understanding the relationship between US military and big oil, it really is a relationship of dependency and sort of they self-sustain each other. So the US military is the biggest purchaser of oil in the world and the biggest consumer of oil in the US, with an appetite of around a million barrels per day. And in 2017 alone, it emitted 59 million tons of CO2. So they really both the military and big oil industries really work together to establish sort of this monopoly they have. And like big oil industries monopoly lobby to monopolize the energy industry and sustain the world's dependence on oil. And an example of the military's contribution is military presence in strategically profitable entities such as the oil fields of Iraq and Afghanistan for the past more than a decade or so. So how do our taxes fund this complex? So as you can see in this infographic, in 2016, the US spent 36% of total expenditure on the Department of Defense, which oversees the US military, and it totaled 611 billion. And in the budget for 2020, 20% was allocated to the military, totaling at 738 billion. So to understand why so much is spent on the military, we also have to sort of see the full scope of US presence in the world. So the US has nearly 800 bases in more than 70 countries worldwide, and that's quite a staggering number compared to other countries combined, totaling at 70 foreign bases altogether. Next slide, please. So I'm going to pass this off to Cody, and the next section is going to be Cody from ILPS, International League of People Struggles, Claire from International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, Portland, and Copeland from Portland Committee of Human Rights in the Philippines. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nay. Really appreciate that introduction. And that introduction, I think the most jarring part of that for me was the fact that you were saying all of the foreign military bases that are not of the US added together is 70. All of the US military bases around the world is over 800. And I think that imbalance of power is such a good introduction for a topic like this when we're talking about a global structure and how not just countries get their power, but how do industries get their power. So when we start talking about this as a complex, right? This webinar is called the Military Fossil Fuel Industrial Complex. And usually we speak about those two systems as separate things. We have the military industrial complex. And oftentimes, like nowadays, I do hear people talk about the fossil fuel industrial complex. But I think that when we're really talking about where the source of these industries' power comes from, you can't have one without the other. And so that's why today we're going to be talking about this whole complex system as connected. So where do these companies get their power? I want you to put that in the chat box. If you have any ideas, any thoughts, we're going to be talking about it throughout this webinar, of course. But we want to make sure that folks are talking, folks are also getting their questions out so we can get to those at the end. So please feel free to post your thoughts and your questions in the chat box as we're going forward. Next slide, please, Joseph. Cool. So I want to make a brief clarification. We're going to be talking about the weapons industry, but that doesn't mean that it's not connected to the military, right? The military is, the US military is the actual force that is driving wars overseas, that is directing wars against other nations. But it can't get its power except through the weapons industry, which is where the technology that the military uses is produced. So they're related yet separate, but neither can exist without the other. And the question is, which is the one that calls the shots? I was talking to someone recently, and she was saying, like, I don't know if Lockheed Martin is just another arm of the government, or if the government is just another arm of Lockheed Martin. And that really hit it for me, because if the military is making decisions about war and which country to invade next based on the profits of an industry, you could almost say that the government itself is just an arm of that industry. But of course, it's not just the military industry that uses the government as its other arm, right? It's the fossil fuel industry as well. Because if there's one thing that military technology needs, it's oil. It's gas for the so-called green energy bombers that Boeing advertises on its website. True story, you should go and check it out. It's quite the paradox. So we want to just make that clarification clear. We're going to be talking about the military, but before we do that, excuse me, we're going to be talking about the industry that supplies the military and where these industries get their power. Next slide. So how complex really is this complex? It's very complex, but also in the bigger picture, it's not that complex when you look at how it all fits together. So we're going to break this up now into different sections. We're going to talk about the economic power of the military fossil fuel industrial complex. We're going to talk about the political power that keeps that economic power in place. We're going to talk about the social and cultural aspects of this complex that continue to justify its existence, even though that existence is threatening our own existence. So for that, I'm actually going to pass it off to Copeland, who's going to take us into the inner workings of this complex.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Cody. I appreciate that clarification and background, because it's really important to understand that, yeah, the military doesn't just act on its own accord, right? Like, it's not the military who's making the decisions to just like march around the world and start bombing people or occupying spaces. but it's um, a systemic thing that works with people in positions of power and the industries that surround that fuel the need to go out and do these types of interventions. So the first aspect that we're going to look at is the economic, and the bullet points here we'll just kind of dig into. So around unequal trade deals and exploitation of workers, there's the need for cheap labor, right? And investment in places where the resources are. So if you're thinking about, where are oil reserves, where are precious metals and minerals and deposits of things like that, we need to, or people who are interested in getting access to those have to secure them. And so one of the ways that we can do that, or that the US can do that, is trade deals that trade deals and sort of like economic arrangements that favor the U.S. And so what that looks like could be, creating trade agreements, international trade agreements that allow access to certain areas that the host country may not be allowed to go to, or privatizing certain areas in order to mine or things like that. But where those investments are happening are places where labor is cheaper, and things like more relaxed labor laws. So workers on the ground are really being exploited for the pursuit of these uh, precious resources. And then this gets tied back to the investment in stock trading, because those types of things impact the economies in the U.S., right? So where those types of companies or those extractive companies are maybe publicly traded or different things like that. And so then, they have kind of the ability to um, uh, use their bottom line or profit margin as a justification for continuing these practices. And what we see a lot of, I think, is that weapons companies are profitable, and so they're considered like good investments. And so a lot of like institutions or indexes have investments in weapons producing companies. So like Boeing or Lockheed that was mentioned, different companies like that, where we have these investments that are going to expand the value of the stocks on the stock exchange. And so they're, kind of pointed to as the reason that we should utilize those systems. Um, and at the same time, then that kind of highlights the backwards nature of like how exploitation in one place means a change in value in another place. So the workers who are being exploited are the ones who are actually changing the value on the stock exchange. And so there's a unequal and kind of misaligned component there. Um, and so then going on to opening up new markets. So I think maybe a lot of folks here are familiar with the term disaster capitalism, but that's kind of a thing that gets talked about in the context of war, in terms of things that get destroyed, and then when they're going to be rebuilt, the people in positions of to take up that rebuilding are often people who have a stake in those redevelopments. So there's some examples from around the world, right? One example might be Iraq, specifically like Fallujah, where the US was doing a ton of bombing, leveled the city, and then the companies that went in to rebuild and got those contracts were companies that were connected to people in political office. So like maybe the biggest example might be Halliburton, right? And Dick Cheney, who served under the first George Bush, and then went to work for Halliburton, and then came back into the second Bush administration as the vice president. So it's obvious that he has a stake in the rebuilding of places Fallujah, because his company, or the company that he used to be connected to, directly benefits from that. Um, and the other weird part about that is it's a oil company. Like Halliburton is kind of an energy production or services company. So now they have control over the infrastructure that's being built back in that location. Another example of kind of this idea about war opening new markets is in the Philippines. There's a place called Marawi City in on the southernmost island. It's a predominantly Muslim area, and a handful of years ago, the U.S. Kind of worked with the Philippines under the guise of the War on Terror to just do a ton of bombing in Marawi City, flatten the entire city, and then the same thing happened where the Philippine government, with private companies, started coming in and looking at that area for tourism redevelopment. And that's still ongoing. So you can still find articles where they're talking about like, oh, we need to clean this place up and get it ready for tourists to come in and utilize that. So again, there's kind of this opening of new markets through the use of this like idea of the war on terror, to hand over land and places to companies to profit and benefit from. And then the other economic aspect is, or one of the others, is the sort of self-perpetuating cycle that is kind of war and fossil fuel economies or industries, informing each other. So like, if you need to secure access, you employ military force. But in order to power the military, like Cody kind of called out earlier, you have to have connections to weapons companies, to fossil fuel industries, and these different things. And I think, I'm not sure this is the best example, but one way I think this has shown up is an example like Standing Rock, where you're trying to install like an oil pipeline, which is benefiting oil companies. And when people start to call that out, then they're met with, military National Guard resistance, which need to have the weapons and everything to enforce the laws that the government is setting up to protect the oil, pipelines and things like that. So yeah, through that you can kind of see how the supply is used to justify the demand and vice versa, and that kind of perpetuates the system of military and fossil fuel production and industry. So if we can go to the next slide. And I think this is also, you can kind of see it's hard to talk about any one of these aspects without kind of hitting on multiple others, right? Because they're all connected. So we've already kind of talked about the political aspects of this. But to jump in here, what we've seen even just recently are like fossil fuel and weapons CEOs are given government positions. So the pictures here on the left, kind of the upper left corner there, you have Rex Tillerson, who was appointed as Secretary of State and no longer is now. But yeah, he was like a former ExxonMobil executive. So you're bringing in somebody whose interests are explicitly fossil fuel industry to the government. And we even saw like the impacts of that through pushes to like open up public lands to drilling and stuff like that, which is totally flies in the face of the intent of those kind of protections and different things like that. And then the other example here is Patrick Shanahan, who is a Boeing executive who was appointed as Secretary of Defense. So again, you kind of see this merging of industry and politics. And yeah, we talked about Cheney and Halliburton, so that's another kind of example of what that kind of how that can show up. And yeah, so then so pro-industry policies like subsidies through tax dollars. Yeah, we've just seen how lobby efforts from big companies place the importance and emphasis on industry interests rather than interests that have anything to do with how people are living, right? Yeah, so companies that are these big weapons companies actually have a lot of power to lobby and go to Congress and make deals and kind of do these pro industry subsidies and different things like that. And in addition, the government favors contracts with companies in different ways where they can cut deals with them or offer tax incentives or different things like that in order to allow the companies to increase production or yeah, continue to exploit the land and labor in order to yeah, keep producing. And then, yeah, I think I just kind of mentioned the like tax incentives. One way that we see that locally is through state and city governments kind of vying for job creation. I mean, we kind of saw that very publicly with Amazon, but that also happens with military weapons industry type companies, right? So states will say like, oh, you know, if you come and put your Boeing plant in our state or city, that will give you a tax break on property taxes or different things like that. And companies can actually shop that around. So you can say like, well, you know, this state over here gave us this much in tax breaks, but this state is going to give us these things. So we're actually going to go over here to this one. And in that way, you're sort of pitting states and cities against each other, and you're allowing companies to take advantage of these of that type of competition. Um, and yeah, I think I had another point, but I'm forgetting what it was. So yeah, and then I mean, obviously, the other way that we see pretty kind of front and center, even just recently, is that the U.S. uses puppet politicians in other countries to forward our interests. So, you know, if you look at the countries where we're kind of involved in appointing leaders to other countries, most if not all of them are places where we stand to gain from either oil or precious resources in some capacity. So, you know, on these pictures, you can kind of see Trump doing an arms deal with Saudi Arabia, and there's relationships around the oil there, and he's kind of come out and protected and stood up for their government in certain ways. The other pictures are of President Duterte in the Philippines and Bolsonaro in Brazil, who the U.S. has had a strong part in installing in order to protect and request the interests or protect the interests for resource extraction and for weapons sales and different things like that. So yeah, so those are kind of the ways that the political context reinforces these industries and helps prop up and perpetuate them. And with that, I think I'll pass it along to Claire to talk about the other two aspects.
Thank you so much, Copeland. That was such a great exploration of the economic and political elements of the military fossil fuel industrial complex. I'm going to move a little bit into the social and cultural aspects, knowing that they are deeply intertwined with the economic and political. So thinking about all of these as working together in a lot of ways. But so we do see the military fossil fuel industrial complex really deeply implicated in the interlocking oppressions that structure our society. Racism, xenophobia, and the cis-hetero patriarchy are all really tangled up in the tentacles of this system in which war and climate change feed one another while being exploited for profit. For instance, the Department of Homeland Security website has a long list of quote unquote prime contractors, including big names like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and BAE Intelligence and Security. As the Trump administration leverages racism and nationalism, and now we see also the fears of COVID-19 that he's working with, to ramp up Homeland Security, these companies are profiting directly from deportations and the militarization of our southern border. So they are literally making a profit on human suffering while leaving a really devastating carbon footprint. You know, some of these industries are among the biggest polluters, the biggest emissions producers in the world. And then they kind of have the nerve to promote their sustainability initiatives in an effort to greenwash themselves. As I was going through these websites, so often, you know, sustainability was the second or third thing on their drop-down menu. So they're really making an effort to promote themselves as these champions of the environment when they are anything but that. Let's see here. We could also do a whole series of webinars on the environmental racism that structures the way that different communities experience geography and the ability to move through space and access nature, both here in the US and worldwide. Down below here on this image, we see an image of a chemical plant in inner city Detroit. And so often we're finding that fossil fuel refineries, chemical weapons plants, and other heavy polluters are really strategically located next to really vulnerable communities. So that might be working class communities, communities of color, rural communities. And again, this is happening both in the US and in the global South and worldwide. The people who are standing to gain the most from the military fossil fuel industrial complex are able to keep their backyards pristine, their water sources pure and sparkling, their access to nature untampered with, while those who are most at risk are forced to grapple with the health and environmental effects of living next door to these really dangerous neighbors. There's so much literature on the increased health effects of, you know, different kinds of cancers, lung problems, allergies, anything ranging the gamut from the annoying to the debilitating to the fatal that folks who live next door to these kinds of industries are experiencing. And all of this, of course, also plays into the ways in which the US-centered global economy really favors big industries, so privileging them over and over again. While countries in the global South are strategically kept impoverished and underdeveloped, military and fossil fuels corporations are able to pollute with impunity. The countries who stand to suffer the most from climate change are typically those contributing least to the problem. We're seeing the profits from the complex flowing always towards the global north and towards wealthy individuals and corporations, while vulnerabilities relating to the rising sea levels, higher temperatures, and increasing political instability tend to flow towards vulnerable communities in the global South. I think we can move on to the next slide. Thank you so much. So next we're going to be talking a little bit about the cultural implications of the military fossil fuel industrial complex, which again, really inseparable from the social implications as well as the political and economic that we just talked about. But really the bedrock of our culture has been irrevocably shaped by the military fossil fuel industrial complex. As the late anti-capitalist cultural theorist Mark Fisher wrote, "It is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism." I'm just going to say that one more time in this apocalyptic moment that we're living through, but it is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism. Our imaginations have been so deeply informed by the culture of war and disconnection from the living world that we don't even know how limited our visions have become. It's just the water that we swim in. So it's whether we're talking about the macho militaristic and racist movies funded by the Pentagon. Up there at the top, you can see Top Gun, which was funded by the Pentagon in the 80s to combat anti-Vietnam War sentiment, as well as Zero Dark 30, which was funded by the Pentagon to combat anti-war on terror sentiment. Whether we're talking about the honor the troops rhetoric that makes it dangerous to question our involvement in endless foreign wars, the warmongering and pro-business media pundits who deny climate change, praise the military, and scoff at anyone who questions the wisdom of limiting our dependence on fossil fuels. You know, here even we see on MSNBC people calling the missile strikes on Syria beautiful. We are bombarded every day, if not every minute, with the profit-driven agendas of the military fossil fuel industrial complex. It even affects seemingly innocuous platforms like our weather outlets, which refuse to name climate change as a prime driver of the new weather patterns we're seeing worldwide, even though meteorologists in other countries, you know, name that it's, you know, climate change is causing this heat wave, this, you know, droughts and floods and fires, all these things. Televised meteorologists here in the States won't mention it. And we're, of course, seeing all of this play out in super high drive during the time of COVID-19, whether it's Trump using, well, Trump and others using militarized language and talking about waging war on the virus, or the fuel wasting flyovers that you see here below, ostensibly orchestrated to honor essential workers during the pandemic, when, of course, there are lots and lots of other ways that money and fuel could be used to actually make tangible changes in their lives. It is said that rulers rule through the consent of the governed. But it's hard to know what consent even means in a culture that has been so deeply shaped by human suffering, environmental degradation, and corporate greed that the governed can't even see what else might be possible. Our consent has been manufactured in the same factories that mass produce the instruments of war and climate change. But I want to leave with a little glimmer of possibility here. As the late writer Ursula Le Guin wrote, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable." And I would add, we live in the shadow of the military fossil fuel industrial complex, and its power seems inescapable. But then, Le Guin continues, so did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. So what we're ultimately hoping to come away with from this examination of the military fossil fuel industrial complex is where we as human communities can intervene, how we can withdraw our consent, and what it might mean to imagine something new. So I'm going to turn it back over to Cody to wrap up with some final thoughts on the political, economic, social, and cultural implications of the complex, and then we're going to move on to some case studies.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claire and Copeland. Claire, I don't think I'm ever going to forget. I mean, you said a lot of one-liners I'm never going to forget, but one of those last ones being that our consent is manufactured in the same factories that's manufacturing the weapons and the and oil. That's so jarring, especially when you think of the way that our culture is shaped by those who rule to govern the rules to keep the system going. And that kind of brings us to this sort of summary of how all of these aspects fit together. Everything that Copeland and Claire spoke about are arranged in a very specific way to keep the powers at bay. So I made this little diagram here that we can probably do a whole other webinar just on this diagram, but we're going to have to suffice with just a couple minutes to kind of go through this. So if you want to understand the inner workings of how the complex maintains itself, you need to follow the money. So this diagram is showing the flow of money, but it's more than just that, because it starts up on our left side at the beginning of the economic section, where Copeland talked about the unequal trade deals that is allowing multinational corporations to set up their global production lines so that the very first part of their process is exploiting workers as much as they physically can. Countries where there's low labor standards, countries where there's low human rights standards, the ability to squeeze as much out of workers as possible is how all of this starts. So if all these arrows are pointing to the next little square where we have ExxonMobil, General Electric, Boeing, that's just, a drop in the lake of all the different logos we could put on there. It's not money that flows from the workers to the corporations. It's their labor. It's the actual blood, sweat, and tears that workers are putting into building, and extracting the resources and building the actual machines that are commodified and sent out to be used as a profit by the fossil fuel and military companies. And once that happens, the next one we have there is we can see our good friends in Wall Street being giving a comeback, and through the investments and getting dividends from those investments, Wall Street and the fossil fuel military companies are actually benefiting themselves, both using their own power to continue to grow money, which is still flowing in from the labor of the workers. And then the big ones in the middle, where you have the government through all of its pro-business and militarist policies, is creating the basis, a need to continue to buy fossil fuels and military. It'll keep spending its own money, putting itself into a miserable debt sometimes even to keep buying oil and bombers and tanks to load the oil into. But whose money is the government's money when it comes down to it? And this is where our manufactured consent comes into. Now, this doesn't mean that people don't have free will. All of us have free will. That's why, we make decisions throughout the day. It's why all of us here on our webinar right now, and why all of us will do whatever it is we're going to do after this. But the whole point about manufactured consent that Claire was talking about is that it's informed by the messages we're given every single day. So that's where all of the government spending on media, on entertainment, to make us think that there is no other way, to make us, again, imagine the end of the world before we imagine the end of capitalism. And so that money flows back in interest to the government through our tax dollars. And that's a very important part of this webinar, because our coalition is focused on really challenging the role of our tax dollars, our money, going to the military fossil fuel industrial complex. And that's how and then this cycle starts all over again, with the US buying more weapons, buying more energy, Wall Street continuing to throw more of its money into these corporations to cream off the top, the bit at the top for its own dividends. And then the ones who are always squeezed the most, the ones who are at the mercy the most, are the workers who have no choice but to give their labor to these companies to actually make the items that are creating all of this wealth. And then all of the people at the receiving end of these wars that are launched by the military. Because remember, it's the military who makes the decisions, but it's the industries that call the shots and hold all the power. And so with this, this diagram of how the complex works, I'm going to hand it back to Nay, who's going to introduce us to our next speakers, who are going to give us a bit more of a personal look at how this affects people.
Yes, thank you, Cody, Copeland, and Claire, for really going into the social, cultural, and economic aspects of the complex. So I'm going to pass it to Joseph and Bea of Anak Bayan PDX, and they're going to go into the Philippines case study, and which is a place that is heavily affected by the US, and specifically the US military.
Right. Let me go ahead and. Okay, here we go. So thanks, Nay. So we're gonna go into a little bit about the Philippine case study. So if you don't know, that's where the Philippines is. And yeah, it's right there in the Southeast Asia. Okay, and so just to give us some context, when we look at the climate crisis, how Anak Bayan really defines it is really looking at what is the root causes of it. And we identify that imperialism is actually a big contributor to the climate crisis. And so the imperialist plunder, such as like the extraction of natural resources, logging, mining, drilling, and really like that aggressive development, plus all of the carbon emission that comes with that, and the fossil fuels from oil, coal, etc., really contributes to the climate change and creating a lot of like extreme weather changes and the rising tides of the sea. And so let's talk a little bit about what does climate change look like in the Philippines.
All right, so we have 5 risk factors over here, as you can see from the Climate Reality Project. Related to what Claire said earlier, those that are responsible for producing carbon emissions, the most carbon emissions, pollutants, etc., they're the ones who have access to clean water, they're the ones who have beautiful backyards, while countries that contribute so little to carbon emissions and pollution are the ones that suffer the most. And the Philippines is one of the top countries that suffers from climate change. As you can see, it's an archipelago. It's made up of thousands of small islands. So that means that it is at incredible risk from rising sea levels. All major cities, municipalities are built along the coast, and majority of the population live in those areas. The Philippines has 106 million people. 68 million live by the coast, and that number increases every day because the coast is where economic activity primarily occurs. So that figure continues to rise. The Philippines is also really vulnerable to extreme rainfall. Every year, there are floods that happen in various vulnerable communities all over the Philippines. This is connected to deforestation, mining, um, decimation of mangroves, um, 90%, over 90% of the Philippine rainforests have been lost to illegal logging, deforestation, and so on. Extreme heating events in the Philippines, it has become increasingly unlivable, especially during the summer months. Last year and this year saw the highest heat indices that the country has ever seen. So what a heat index is it's not the recorded temperature, but what the temperature feels like for people with regards to humidity. So last year, the highest recorded heat index was 125 degrees Fahrenheit in Tagupan City. And this year, just a few days ago, the highest heat index so far, as the Philippines is in the middle of summer, was 122 degrees Fahrenheit in Butuan City. So this puts people at risk of heat exhaustion, heat stroke. Then there is, yeah, it's really hot. There's also increased ocean temperatures. A lot of the Philippine economy relies on fishing, and a lot of vulnerable families rely on fishing. There are over 1 million fisher folk in the Philippines, and 800,000 of them are small scale, providing fish for their communities and for their families. Because of the rising ocean temperatures, coral reefs are dying, mangroves are dying, fish are being forced to migrate, and access to fish is getting further and further away from shores, requiring ships over the boats that these fishermen have access to. There's also changes in the water budget. So last year, the Philippines saw a water shortage crisis.
All right. And so what does that look like? Obviously, people are not just going to sit down and watch imperialists plunder our country, right? And so there's a lot of environmental defenders that are trying to protect the land, but there's also so many environmental defenders that are killed because of this fascist government. And if you look at this graph here, you're seeing that out of all of the countries in the world, the Philippines is actually the #1 in terms of the most environmental defenders killed in 2018, with 30 and then 48 in 2017. Of course, these are only numbers that are recorded, right? And so just gonna go into, like, if you see here, this is kind of also saying what are the different environmental disasters that they're trying to protest. And mining is, of course, one of the biggest, it is the biggest reason why people are protesting. And so we look here and we're seeing like some environmental defenders from the past that have been killed in the country, including like Leonard Coe, who was a Philippine botanist scientist from UP Diliman. And he was just doing some field work, and they thought he was just they thought he was actually part of the New People's Army in the Civil War, and they just decided they'll just shoot him on the spot. And then we have a lot of Lumad or indigenous people in Mindanao. And as I said earlier, mining is one of the biggest reasons for environmental defenders being killed. That's because a lot of indigenous people are trying to protect that land, as it is their ancestral land, right? And so with that, also a lot of the Lumad schools are being harassed, and a lot of paramilitary forces are trying to push them off of their land. In fact, I was able to visit a couple of the schools when I was in the Philippines in 2014 and 2016. And yeah, they were saying how over and over again they have to evacuate because they're worried about their safety, and because some of their leaders and teachers have been killed in the classrooms. And then finally, we have Brandon Lee on the far left, who is he is a environmental defender, and also for the Ifugao community particularly. He was helping to stop a dam being built in northern Luzon, but he is still alive. He was shot 6 or 7 times, I believe, and no, 7 times. And he is from a San Francisco University alumni. And he's not even Filipino, he's Chinese American. And so just re-emphasizing the international solidarity with the Philippines. He is actually here in the States now. He was evacuated safely with his family, but they are trying to find affordable housing, as it's difficult to live in San Francisco, let alone struggling physically as well. So let's talk a little bit about the history about that, of why the relationship of the U.S. is to the Philippines.
All right, thank you, Joseph. Yeah, so a quick history lesson. In 1898, there was the Spanish-American War. And in the end, the Americans basically had a fake battle on Manila Bay. So that's what this image is. It's a depiction of the Battle of Manila Bay. They actually had a secret agreement with Spain, like, let's stop fighting and let's do this deal. But we have to show everyone else that, like, we actually got this through winning, quote unquote, in the Philippines. So the secret deal that the U.S. and Spain had was that the U.S. was buying, or the U.S. bought rather, the Philippines together with Puerto Rico and Guam for a total of $20 million from Spain. And so the Philippines was a colony of the United States from 1898 to 1946. And in this time, this specifically from 1933 to 1941, had the largest gold mining operations in the Philippines to this day. By the end of the occupation, 70% of trade was reliant on the US, and the Philippine economy continues to be reliant on the US. So over here, you can see a photo of the Benguet Mining Company on one side. It was established in 1903. It's the oldest mining company. It was founded by 3 Americans. It continued under American ownership until 1971. There's a law in the Philippines that says that businesses have to be primarily owned by Filipinos. It was a reaction to hundreds of years of colonization, but honestly, a lot of companies are controlled by foreign interests, and they get essentially sort of Filipino puppet masters for them to, or rather, they're the puppet masters, and they do control the companies and just say, oh, this Filipino actually owns most of it, which is untrue. They took over the Filipino economy from a subsistence agriculture and converted it, setting up infrastructure to harvest raw materials that supplied Americans in shortages and that they used to trade with other countries, and they'd sell back to us the surplus. So in 1946, they made a show of giving Filipinos their independence. But in 1946, they also created the Bell Trade Act, which ensured free trade access to Philippine resources would continue. So economically, nothing really changed. In the 1950s, they even installed U.S. advisors in banks who then helped shape bank policies within banks. And military presence continues to this day. So since 1898 up until now, there are numerous military bases in the Philippines, as well as naval bases. In 1951, we had the Mutual Defense Treaty, which legally allowed the U.S. to have these military bases in the Philippines. When that expired 50 years later, there's a lot of anti-American sentiment at the time. So the president was like, okay, yeah, we got to get these bases out. But that was really just for show, to show the people that they were listening to their demands. They really ended up making a big show of it, but kept the bases, and those bases continue to operate. And they just renamed the treaty into different things: visiting forces agreement, mutual logistics support agreement, enhanced defense cooperation agreement. It's all the same thing with different name. So in the guise of protection, the U.S. military presence continues in the Philippines, disguising itself as protecting the Philippines, but really there to continue resource extraction through mining and other means. And also continues to use the Philippines as a market to sell us more goods. More on this later. So as I said earlier, the Philippines continues to be dependent on the US economy. Oh, sorry, could you change the slide, please? Thank you, Joseph. They are our biggest investor, and they're also our biggest beneficiary of the Philippine economy. They keep the Philippine military well supplied, as you can see here. So, sorry, could you click to show the next image? So there we go. So that is a comparison of aid we receive from the US, and 1/3 of it, a little more than 1/3 of it, goes to the military. So the US keeps the Philippine military well supplied in the South, where there are conflicts, as mentioned by Copeland. Marawi is just one example. But there are several territory wars and ideological wars that have been raging on in Mindanao for decades. And the United States feels that. They donate arms, they send soldiers to support the Philippine Army, and they sell arms and other materials. Next, Joseph, sorry. Thank you. So that brings us to what is going on today. So this is President Duterte on March 12 announcing extended community quarantine. And in this image, instead of being flanked by doctors, medical professionals, like a lot of other countries were doing, he decides to have the armed forces chief and the Philippine Army lieutenant behind him as he makes the announcements for what the extended community quarantine entails, one of which is an 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. curfew. All of this to be implemented by March 15. Could you click, please, Joseph? Thank you. And on March 15 itself, the head of the PNP of Metro Manila addresses the media dressed in his combat fatigues, which doesn't make sense. He's a policeman, and that's only something that they're meant to do during war times. So that seems to have a lot of implications and sends a certain message to the Filipino people that he's addressing through the media. Thank you. So military checkpoints, as well as PNP checkpoints, are placed all over the country. On March 25, the Congress granted Duterte special powers to reallocate funds, which he could have done anyway, given the emergencies, but it actually granted them additional powers that are in danger of being exploited. Could you click again, Joseph? Thank you. They've also been doing humiliation tactics to offenders of the extended community quarantine, making them do push-ups, lie under the sun, all these really terrible things, and then recording it and posting it on Facebook and TikTok. On April 2, Duterte gave shoot-to-kill orders to AFP and PNP for people who violate ECQ. And on April 25, they declared that the ABS-CBN would be shutting down, which is the largest broadcasting network, and that has never happened. That hasn't happened since martial law during the Marcos era. And that finally brings us to April 30, where there is a $1.5 billion agreement of sale to the Philippines from the US of attack helicopters, related equipment, and support. So as you can see, instead of responding by supporting hospitals, by supporting medical professionals, they have been militarizing heavily from the start of the pandemic reaching the Philippines.
Hmm. Yeah, in fact, if you read further along in this news statement, they're even pointing out Boeing as one of the principal contractors as well. And so PCHIRP, the Portland Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines, actually started a lot of the research for our coalition, but now our coalition has actually taken up a campaign around saying that Boeing is doing a lot of the environmental and also military issues internationally. So look forward to hearing more about that as we continue along. And I'll pass it back to Nay.
All right, thank you, Joseph and Bea, for that Philippine case study. I'm gonna pass it to Pedro from Sunrise Beaverton Movement, to go over the Portland State case study.
Hi, everyone, and thank you to everyone who spoke. It's these conversations are really important, and to hear about like the more abstract and the more abstract power that there is when we talk about the complexes, and then focusing on these individual spots is really illuminating. And I'm just really grateful to Claire, who spoke earlier, for ending their comments with imagining how capitalism could die, and talking about how the divine rights of kings was also just embedded in our society, and how that's obviously not our situation now. So that's very relieving when we have these conversations, because you can feel the weight of all these complexes working on our lives and on our identities. And it's good to be reminded that things change, and they change very fast often. But so I'm going to talk about Superfund sites in the Portland Harbor. This map on the right, actually, let me start with what Superfund sites are. So in 1980, to tackle hazardous waste on our lands, we passed this act called the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. And this very boring name is more often referred to as the Superfund Act. And this map on the right, all the shades of red are Superfund sites throughout the country. And it's kind of hard to see, but there is some like green and yellow. Green is cleaned up sites, and yellow is like in progress. And the darker reds are like stuff that's on the national priorities list. Yeah, so I think the Superfund site case study is really important, because it highlights how legislation that is proposed to make progress on certain issues is oftentimes just layers of bureaucracy that delay progress and is ultimately inadequate in holding these corporations accountable for their crimes. So on the next slide, the picture on the left is just a quick overview of what the Superfund site here in the Portland Harbor is. It's 11 miles of the river. You could see tar deposits and like just one of the direct dumping sites for industries here. So over 100 years of unregulated dumping that was obviously making these corporations and the city a lot of money, especially when you don't have to have any concern on where your waste is going. It's not an expense that you're budgeting for. So the Portland Harbor was assessed as a Superfund site in 1998 and was bumped up to the national priority list in 2000. And 2000, that was 20 years ago. Nothing's really happened. There's been some like cleanup of hotspots and a couple of paid studies, but most of this time in this last 20 years has been litigation over who's actually responsible for the contamination and how much they're going to take up financially. So if we could go to the next slide. A lot of big names that we keep talking about and are so integrated into all the food systems, all the different types of systems that we have here for our survival. So the potentially responsible parties, there's more than 100, but I just highlighted these here. The Bayer and Arkema corporations are chemical companies, Chevron, Kinder Morgan, Phillips 66, ExxonMobil, energy infrastructure, the Union Pacific Railway, the city of Portland. And before we could even get to a list like this, a lot of these groups had to have been sued by the city or by the EPA to even admit culpability. And then more litigation happened to get a price tag from some of these people's invoices sent to pay for the cleanups and for the studies and hiring contractors to do the work. So on the next slide, we break down the 4 different types of contaminants that we have in the sediment here. They're broken down into PCPs, dioxins and furans, PAHSs, and DDT. So you can see them sprinkled out throughout the river with some of the industries that also blanket the river as well. And PCBs are from industrial lubricants and insulators. They're possibly carcinogens, and they're found all throughout our environment here. The dioxins and furans are known carcinogens, and they're released through chemical combustion processes. And PAHSs are known carcinogens that are released through the combustion of tar and coal specifically. And then DDT has a lot more, I feel, national recognition as a carcinogen, but it's a pesticide as well that can cause persistent nerve damage or damage to your nervous system and reproductive issues. So on the last slide, the cleanup has about a $1 billion price tag estimated to come. And we've had about 18 years of just the planning, the assessment of the damage, and figuring out a plan for work to be done. Most of the work hasn't even been started, and the proposed plan is a 13-year plan. So just the timeline: 1998, Superfund site; 2000, 18 years of assessing this plan, getting it finalized, and we still haven't really kicked off the first year of our cleanup plan. And industry has had decades of profit using this river, which the river was central to so many communities here for fishing, recreation. Its water is life, and we really have destroyed it for all the communities here. And we like to think of the Pacific Northwest as like the last frontier and this oasis of nature out here. And we just have done such a disrespectful job to the closest body of water that we have. Constant litigation has only delayed progress in cleaning the Willamette. And now with our COVID-19 pandemic causing major budget deficits throughout all sectors of our society, these budget deficits bring threats of austerity and budget cuts. Portland Public Schools is talking about cutting their budgets. We've lived through a decade of constant budget cuts. Meanwhile, like we've touched on in this presentation, corporations are able to get tax breaks for bringing their supposed economic power here to our city. Our police departments benefits from budget increases year after year, even while we slash essential services. It's really, really upsetting just to see it in all these different angles, whether it's overseas, here in our backyards, or in any other facet of our society. So from here, we're gonna open this up to Q&As, correct? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pedro, for going over the local effects of some of what we've been talking about. So yeah, we just want to open up the floor and invite anyone to ask questions. You can unmute yourself or type in the chat box, and yeah, just open the discussion up.
Hi, this is Janet, and I've been keeping track of people's comments as we've been going through this really in-depth look at these two intersecting crises. So I, and just lots of appreciation for all the presenters. I um, I was interested in Michael from Seattle, his comment on Boeing polluting the Duwamish River in close to the Seattle downtown core. And Michael, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that to get us started.
Sorry, I guess I was muted for a bit. Hi, Michael here from PUSA, which stands for the Philippine-U.S. Solidarity Organization in Seattle, also a member of ITRIP US. Yeah, responding to your comment, yeah, so much like every other place in the country, Seattle is on, indigenous grounds, the Duwamish, which is very, linked to and is a source of life, and being a water source, is something that the area was militarized, occupied by settlers, and just historically, where I live kind of in the south area of Seattle, and just south of here you'll see Boeing Field, and lots of the other like Boeing factories and production plants. And just generationally over time, these plants have been very much responsible for the pollution of the Duwamish River, which is very close to the Duwamish people, and subsequently now the pollution of the Puget Sound overall. So I think that's where that comment came from. I think just relating it to like the pollution that was being documented by Pedro, of the Willamette. Also very much like going to my visits to Portland, bordering very much a main artery coming from the main city core, and just seeing, I think, other commonalities in other urban cores, places where people are forced to go to urban areas to look for jobs, and then even just the degradation in the environment that comes subsequently from that type of human activity.
Amy asked the really, really big question, how do we withdraw our consent? So who would like to speak to that? Yeah. Just before someone else gets on, I'd just like to say thank you, Amy. That question is so central to our work in so many ways. And I don't know if you want to say something more. We're all unmuted now, so, or you can unmute yourself if you'd like to elaborate on your question.
Oh, I guess my question was just kind of comes from like, if this is a lot of it's funded from like our tax money or like participation as consumers, like, I don't know if you guys had ideas on things you're asking us to do. My husband was asking that question. He's like, so wait, what are we supposed to do? Thanks, you guys.
Hey, this is Copeland from PChirp, and maybe I can just sort of jump in. And I think that it's a great question, and I think it's a question that a lot of us ask ourselves, because it's hard to understand, like, where do we even start? I mean, these systems, and like we talked about, like this complex where all of these things are interconnected. I mean, how do you even start to break into that? So I think, yeah, I think Bea called out the tax resistors group, who I'm not sure if there's a representative on this call, but um, there's a lot of work around the understanding that if our tax money is what is funding and contributing to these systems, that there's a kind of a long history of tax resistors. I know I grew up Quaker, and I know that there's a strong tradition in the Quaker faith, and there's other groups who are taking that up as well. So that's like a one kind of literal way that I think people can kind of dig into, but we also know that that's really hard to do, because if you the way that we interact with taxes and the IRS is like so a part of our economy and our government system and everything. So it's challenging, but then I think beyond that, we can start to just form coalitions like this, where we're sharing information, we're helping get each other educated, and then start looking at locally what are the places in our communities where these things are showing up. So we were talking about Boeing. I think Cody posted a link about how the city local to Portland, Gresham, where the Boeing plant is, got like a huge amount of tax incentives in the form of like not having to pay property tax. And so I think, we can actually start to call out some of those things, as well as the connections with, part of the Boeing campaign for this group is looking at the partnerships with like universities, because that's a big thing. So like, how are universities invested in these same systems, and how can we call that out? And that's kind of our target with Boeing, is saying like, look, these companies are contributing directly to the destruction of the environment, to this fossil fuel cycle, to displacement of people, to killing, destruction, etc. So why are we allowing them to do business with institutions like universities, who should be educating people about how to I don't know, create things for a society that's not based in those types of industries. So I think, yeah, so doing kind of the educational work, and forming groups and coalitions and organizations that are geared towards calling out these types of large, kind of daunting systems, is one way to sort of, yeah, fight back.
I have a response as well. Joseph, could you go back to the slide of the sort of the arrows pointing to each other? And I wanted to go back to that to kind of bring us back to, again, how the system all works together and where the power is derived from. Because I think when there's a question about like how do we respond, how do we like withdraw our consent, it's not something we can do just as individuals, right? That's why it's like, I think on the individual front, there's organizations and individuals that talk about refusing to pay taxes. And I think that's one element that can go into this. But also, if we look at where the corporations are getting their power, again, it's through as long as there are people who need to make a livelihood off of working, and as long as our economy is based on monopolies driving the whole, being the ones to call the shots of who gets to work for them, there will always be a flow of power going to them, because there's always going to be people creating the weapons, creating the fossil fuel infrastructure. And as long as that's happening, the government will always be trying to make a system that is reliant on weapons and energy infrastructure. So I think that the way that we start to imagine that new world and withdraw our consent is by going into collective action together against this power. I think if you're not a member of an organization, you really need to join an organization, because it's organizations that build that people power and can really work on coordinating a strong response. And I think that the people that actually are giving that response collectively as strong as possible are, one, the people at the end of the receiving end of these wars driven by the military and fossil fuel industries, the people who are demanding an end to imperialism, like what Bea and Joseph were talking about in the Philippines. It's about the working class and communities of color in near all the Superfund sites that Pedro was talking about. And of course, it's the workers who are have no choice but to continue to work for these companies, who are also demanding better wages, better livelihood. We need to make sure that our organizations are linked up with them too, because I think that if it's gonna talk about shaking this structure from the places it gets its power, we need to make sure the people most impacted are leading the way. And we need to make sure, in particular, that the workers who provide the basis for any kind of economy to happen have the support they need to fight for a better world alongside all of us.
I put a question myself into the chat. How many U.S. troops are stationed in and around the Philippines? And I ask this also because I'm really concerned about what I see as the warmongering against China now. And of course, the naval forces and maybe others in the Philippines, I think would be drawn into that and are part of U.S. military planning. And also, I just want to say how incredibly moved I was by the case study of the Philippines. I'm just thinking about it so much.
Hey, Janet. Yeah, I don't know the particular number unless someone else does. But yeah, I think that's a good question and something that we should try to see. I don't know if they'd even like post something like that, you know?
Michael has his hand up.
I'll jump on. Yeah, I think a little, like a small estimate, say like 250 to 500, but I think other large estimates that say like upwards and probably more of like 5,000 troops in the country. But I think something that I'll speak from like the ICHRPAT now, like I think that the influence and especially deals that were presented, such as that $2 billion new military deal that just was reported on April 30th, it speaks to more of like the influence and the training, which has been directly linked from the Philippines, from the US to the Philippines, which has been happening for as long as the Philippines has had like independence. And it's the emphasis on quelling the unrest that's been happening in the country, which has more effects on human rights defenders, environmental defenders, and the poor, and across the country. So we'll see. I made a trip down to Mindanao in Marawi, which was the city that was ravaged by U.S. forces back in 2017, and that was a forced evacuation of thousands of people. So I think to answer your question, like succinctly, yeah, as low as 500, as many as 5,000 or even more, but even more so, the influence on training, on funding, of materials, actual like war-making materials that are being moved for the profiteering companies that have been referenced to make war, have been very much have a strong influence in the Philippines. And something I think that we can, to go back to the previous question, also use our voices, our democratic rights to speak to the legislative forces around us. I know that Senator Merkley over in Portland and Oregon is very supportive of an upcoming Philippine human rights bill, and then other ways to just raise the consciousness and education of how our tax money is being used plunder, to attack places like the Philippines all over the world.
Janet, were there any other questions?
I'm not seeing any other questions. I'd like to draw attention to what Benjamin dropped in the chat a while ago, holding communities accountable for any profiting that's happening from these companies. So there are local impacts, as was discussed on the webinar. But I mean, these, even though these seem like such huge forces, they do touch down and they do have specifics where we live.
Were there any more questions or points anyone wanted to discuss before we start wrapping up? Or if you want to drop organization information or contact info so we could collaborate further in the chat. All right, I think I'm going to pass it to Jess.
Thanks, Nay, and thanks to all of our presenters and all of our attendees for such a great event today. This webinar is actually the first in a series of webinars being put on by the Earth Data Tax Day Coalition in the lead up to Tax Day on July 15th. And so we want to invite all of you to join us for our next webinar, which is in 2 weeks from today on May 23rd at 1 p.m., which will be specifically on the role of finance in the weapons and fossil fuel industries. And in addition, we really want to invite you all to take all of what we have talked about today, all of that righteous anger and agitation against this corrupt and collapsing system, and actually take action in our own community to fight with and for each other and for people all over the world, and withdraw our consent from this system like we've been talking about. In addition to this educational webinar series, we're also organizing in the long term because we know it will take more than just 3 months and more than just the 30-something people in this webinar to really create the change that we want to see in the world. And so the organizations in this coalition are currently doing more investigation into Boeing, the multinational weapons corporation, which has multiple local facilities in the Pacific Northwest, like we've been talking about. And we're doing more research and investigation into its local ties, particularly with Portland State University. And so if you're interested in being part of this work to confront the military fossil fuel industrial complex in our own community, we want to invite you to join us in this fight and to attend our upcoming coalition meetings, which are every Sunday at 3 p.m. And if you registered for this webinar, you'll receive an email with all of this information this weekend. And again, just want to thank those of you who stuck with us even after we were Zoom bombed at the beginning of the webinar. This is the first time a lot of us are hosting a public webinar like this, and I just wanted to apologize again for what happened and ensure that we're really learning from our mistakes, and at our following webinar we'll be sure to have security measures in place to prevent that from happening again. And I think that our ability to continue forward after that just shows us the unstoppable power we have through our collective action. And so let us continue to not waver in the face of struggle as we fight together for what we know is just. So thank you again, everyone, and we hope to see you at our next webinar and in the future. Thanks, everyone.